All right, we're live. We're live on YouTube. Oh, and Xian just got here, hugging Sean. Xian and Sean. Welcome everyone to Accessibility in New York City at Asana. I'm Thomas Logan. Happy to be here in person and happy to be again meeting face to face. And also, hello everyone on YouTube. Sorry we had to change the YouTube link at the last moment, but we're always doing lessons learned with this meetup, and we always do want to have people able to participate fully remotely, but we're really happy for everyone that's here with us today in person, and hope you get a chance to meet more people in the community here in New York. I want to say thank you first to Asana, who is our host here. So we're now on a new floor. I think we're on the 48th floor. It's typically a good view, but it's very smoky here today in New York City. But we're up here in 3 World Trade Center, and yeah, thank you to Asana for giving us the space to do this meetup. And as you can see, we have more space in this venue, so please invite more people to come to our event. And we're kind of getting back into the swing post-COVID of helping people meet face-to-face, and that's one of the most important things for our meetup, is enabling people to make new connections here in the city. So we have the space, invite people here, and we'll be doing this every month, as we have been for almost 9 years now. Just want to say a thank you to my co-organizers, Sean Laureate here, Cameron Kunda here. We're the OGs of starting this event, and yeah, we've been working together on this event for a long time. Also want to say thank you to Meryl Evans, who is online, and Meryl is going to be managing our YouTube and making sure that if you are joining us remotely, that your questions also can be asked in person. That's been a goal of our meetup from the beginning, never to require people to come physically in person. So we've always been hybrid, and it wasn't COVID that drove us to that. You know, it's a good benefit to enable people to participate, you know, remotely or hybrid. So we've always been like that. We want to thank Jolie McPhee in the back here, who has been also working with us from the very beginning to make sure that we broadcast on the internet, on YouTube. So we always broadcast to YouTube live, and we also keep recordings of every presentation. So if you are interested in a previous topic, you can always go back to our YouTube and see the full details of what's been done. And I also want to thank Mirabai Knight, who is our human captioner, and we've always had human captioning. I'll talk about that a little bit in my presentation tonight. But over here to my right, we're displaying Mirabai's captions on a monitor in the room, but we also have that coming through live on YouTube and or Zoom or wherever we stream. So we've always had that, and we'll continue to have that. So thank you, Mirabai. We want to thank our sponsors. So Equal Entry, which is my company. let's thank me. Let's thank Events, which Events is an automated accessibility solution that works to identify accessibility issues. Thank Fable. Fable is a Canadian company that is an accessibility platform powered by people with disabilities. You can work with them to have your site tested by people with disabilities. We want to thank Google, which I just call a global IT company. Thank you, Google. And again, Asana, who's our host here, which is a work management platform. All right, so let me get into my presentation, and thank you again for everyone coming here. So my presentation, From Barriers to Breakthroughs, my journey in digital accessibility. I actually did have ChatGPT help me write that. I don't know if that's good or bad, but just being honest, that tried it out. And I wanted to give a presentation about working for about 20 years in this industry of accessible technology and share, I guess, my lessons learned and why, where I am now, why I do what I do, because it's informed from the whole experience. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn at Tech Thomas, and yeah, and my company's Equal Entry. So let's go back in time to why did I start in accessibility, and I guess this is the starting point that I've been asked my whole life working in this space. Like, why do you care about this? Why is this what you're interested in? Do you know someone with a disability? This is like stuff I hear all the time. So my story is I started in 2002 at the University of North Carolina, and I worked on ancient world maps, and I was able to have a digital service at that year where the idea was how would you make a map accessible to someone that can't see the map? And so this is my first introduction to the idea of accessibility and what it can do. This is Jason Morris on the screen, who Jason was a graduate student at UNC who was in the classics department, and he needed access to information in ancient maps to work on his degree in the classics department. So pretty much immediately my first introduction of why do I care about this, I knew someone that really needed it, and I knew that my work that I was doing was meaningful, and I guess this is what continues to drive me for doing the work in accessibility. But I do look back to this experience as being like, this is pretty much the reason why I got inspired to do this work, and it was because I worked with a real person that could benefit from the work that pretty much the reason why I got into accessibility was he posed this problem to a class. In my computer science class, I met someone, he basically met Jason serendipitously on the campus, and he said, he was talking to him about what he needed, what kind of access challenges he had, and Jason explained, well, I'm in the classics department, and all of the maps that I need to do my research aren't accessible. So Dr. Bishop made that a project.
That Lav died, so switch to this one.
Lav died. So basically it was, he met him just walking around on campus, and it really speaks to, there's problems with the ancient world, but there's also problems with the current world accessing. So basically Jason needed help navigating the campus of UNC, and that's how he met the professor that got me inspired into this. And so, you know, the project that I did was called BATS, Blind Audio Tactile Mapping System. And I guess one of the things that I have about this, and I know some of the people here in the room are university students, I feel like, you know, one of my takeaways from it when I did the project was, you know, I was really excited. It got media stories, Wired wrote about it. It was in Python success stories. But maybe one of my takeaways that I feel like is very important is just having the story of working on helping, you know, a person with a disability do something with technology doesn't mean that it's actually solving the problem. And so if I reflect back on what I did in 2002, I have later in my presentation, I basically worked on the exact same problem 15 years later, and it's not changed at all. So you can demo something that is cool, and maybe even the media is like, oh, this is great, but is it really making a change? So that's just something that I think is important to think about, and not to take away for any students here working on these projects, but I would say be aware of that and think about that, because really what matters, in my opinion, doing this for a long time, is getting it implemented at the big companies and making big changes. So it's very cool to know, like my project was, ancient world, England, I can't remember what century it was, but we mapped it all out. But that's just one map, right? And there's millions of maps. So how do you get this to actually be something that happens for every map? And I feel like we're still asking that question. So I reflect back on saying, like, this is something that was very cool. And at the time, I thought it's really changing things. But I can kind of look back at it and say, all the same problems still apply. And I want to leave that as a motivation of one of my other big pictures from this talk is we do have to influence the big companies that are responsible for building these technologies to make the change. And it can't really come from academic technical demos. It does have to come from the commercial world. I don't have sound. I don't think that will come through here. Oh.
One of the most existentialistic of sensory deprivations, because if you don't see it, if you don't perceive it, if it's not there, it does not exist and cannot do anything for you.
We do what is called a cognitive map, in which I walk, and in my mind I have a map to go from one list sound to the next sound to the next spot. And in order to go back, I have to follow exactly the way I first entered.
It's an old campus, the buildings are close together. It creates sound and wind differences when you're walking. The bell tower chimes every 15 minutes. That's long as you're lost on campus. Traffic is your friend because it's generally always a constant. Driving Cameron Avenue, 2 in the afternoon, absolutely nothing going on. Tough.
Certain streets have become a real challenge, even though you have a crosswalk.
And the blend between the sidewalk and the street is almost it's not detectable. There's no change. Many times when we build an accessible feature like curb cuts, for certain populations like blind vision impaired, this is very, very difficult.
They're always putting up barriers, or there's a breakdown in a line and they've got a sidewalk tore up that we have no idea about, or the truck will be parked on one of the brick sidewalks. And I have walked into, I don't know how many side mirrors on trucks, that shouldn't be parked there. If that is to happen.
And so I just show this video again to say, basically, this is Barb Riverdahl. She's kind of second blind person I met in my life, and she really informed me more. First project was about the ancient world. Our second project was about our campus on University of North Carolina and about just the barriers that exist in day-to-day existence. And I feel like, again, this is 2002, so this is quite a while ago, but the barriers that she's talking about, like running into like a side mirror, and or like there's cars parked on the street, or there's construction that went into an area that wasn't announced. These are all still very current issues and still an opportunity to, I think, create big change, and make that be better. But that really inspired me also at that time. Like I kind of had the idea of the digital world and the real world in a very early project. And I think that's also just important to consider. I feel like working, sometimes if you do computer science or you work in tech, you only think about the screen. But I guess, when you really start learning about the barriers that exist in our world, it's so important to meet people and really learn what matters. And maybe what doesn't matter is like adding alt text to an image on a website. It's like, I don't want to run into like a side mirror on the street. So that's just something, again, that for me, I feel like is very important. And it's sometimes easy in the technology industry to not be working with people that are experiencing the real challenges, and maybe to over focus on some technical issue that's not actually the problem that needs to be solved. So just putting that out there, that's something I can look back on in my first project that I probably didn't have any awareness of at the time of doing it, but now after doing this for many years, it's basically like, I think it's really cool that my first project, I did have the real world challenge and the digital world challenge, because I feel like I see that now just more and more and more with what we work on. All right, so let's okay. So then from that project, I moved to Microsoft, and my first work at Microsoft was on Windows Vista. So depending how old you are, Windows Vista is famous for being like a big failure for Microsoft, and it was a hard place to work because it was always going to ship in 3 months for like 3 years. So it's very stressful to always think you got to finish it, but it was never finished, basically. But that was sort of my like first dive in, and I remember at this time, so again, this is like 2002, they told me in the HR department at Microsoft, wow, there's not been a student that wants to work in accessibility. This is really unique. And again, I can see that now as a more positive change that's happened in the years, that now universities have, you know, curriculums, there's like whole programs about accessibility. This is very common to happen, but for me, I guess at that time, it probably is evidence that there wasn't much work in this space. So they were like, this is cool that you want to do this, but you come in, there wasn't a lot of training or knowledge about how to do it well. And so one of the things that I found interesting, again, at that time was, you know, they were really interested in marketing. I remember this like title, Student Finds Life's Work, for this PR piece that they did. And at the time I was like, well, I don't know if that's really how I feel about this work. But now, again, 20 years later, I'm like, no, they were right. Like I couldn't really get away from this. So it's a funny like memory from that I had the passion to do it then. And I think that's something else that I'll just acknowledge, that a lot of the people I worked with 20 years ago are still working in this space. And I think that's pretty interesting about our industry, that when people do get passionate about this, it's often hard to, you know, go into another area because you do get so invested in it. And so I remember one speaker at our meetup said, it's like the Matrix, take the blue pill or the red pill. But, you know, once you start seeing the world this way, I do think it's very hard to get out of it. So again, this is something that I think is great about students getting to work on projects young. And I'll just say, yeah, I mean, really, like, I didn't think that at the time. Maybe if you are working on an accessibility project, you'll find it the same way, that you really, once you get this passion, you can't stop being passionate about it. And I hope you feel that way. Oh my gosh, I don't know. I just put this in here as a little bit of a bit, but this is a stretch SUV. And I remember, again, this is just my youth, but working at Microsoft at the time I worked there, I felt like we were working for this disability conference. It's called CSUN. It's still a very important accessibility conference, and it's pretty much still, you know, one of the biggest conferences to go to if you care about digital accessibility and other topics. But even in my like naive youth, I'm like, it seems a little strange to have a stretch SUV when we're taking people around with disabilities, blind or mobility impaired. Like, why is this like, why is this the like cool thing to do? And I guess it's just a funny thing for me to look at. I just threw it in here as an example of, if you really think about what matters to people, which I felt like even at that time, I'm like, I don't feel like if I, for example, if I was blind, I don't care that I'm in this thing. And also, even if I can see, I don't really want to be in this event. But at the time, it was just sort of this idea of like showing excess. And I'm like, you know, that's again, I have just a big problem of like being demonstrative about that you care versus actually doing work to show that you're really doing it. So I'd rather have Microsoft Vista be totally accessible than be driven around in this thing. Another thing that, again, I'm just going really far back, but I think one of the things that I also thought about making this presentation is a lot of the ideas that come up in technology, we always want to celebrate them as like very new ideas, but there's usually already like a prior art or previous implementation. And I think a lot of people have this basically ego to invent something new and make something, I created the solution that's going to solve everything. This is kind of one of my first things working in my job was this idea of these control patterns, and it was called UI automation. And maybe still in my head, I'm like, I feel like this implementation is better than what we have today. But ultimately, another way of looking at it is like, I don't think it matters. What matters is that we actually implement something and it works. So I really had a lot of experience working at Microsoft, which was my like only really formal corporate job. But I had this work of needing to work with Sun Microsystems, IBM, Microsoft, try to get everyone to agree on something to implement. And there was a lot of arguments about, no, my idea is better, my idea is better. And in my whole career, I'm just like, it doesn't really matter. Like, you basically just need to fix the problem, like what you call it, exactly how you do it. I do think it'd be better if we had like industry consistency, but again, putting this up here to be like, well, if I was gonna take my ego, I'd be like, this is the better implementation. The control patterns was this idea of speech control of software interfaces, also having speech synthesizers for people who are blind. So the idea was the interface can read out to you and you can control the interface with your voice. And I think this has constantly come up in my career. This is great. Like, assistive technologies want to control the interface and read the interface out. Controlling the interface has a lot of security concerns, right? And so unfortunately, like, I feel like this is just not changed from 20 years ago, that if you let someone control a computer, that could be a hacker, that could be, that could be someone helping a person with a disability, or it could be someone controlling the computer and hacking it. And there were some very famous problems that happened because of the accessibility implementations, like in Windows Vista. Won't go into those details, but I feel like that's one of the like challenges where we're like, we still have that problem. Like, it would be much better to have full control and let people do that. But there's always this balance with security and accessibility. So back then, this is just throwing up, it's still important. Automation, allow the applications below to control other applications. This is a screenshot from Mac, but probably if you're on a Mac, you've got these warnings and you have to do these things, but it's still the same issue, that giving these permissions to allow things to be controlled is very much tied into security, and it's also very much tied into accessibility. And the work I did at Microsoft back then was trying to take advantage of that, but I feel like we still have the same problem, that you can't enable that without introducing security problems. So good thing to work on. There's no solution 20 years later. And then, another thing that I think is a big part of my company, but when I started doing accessibility work, the marketing of why people should care was you can also do automated testing. So if you go back 20 years ago, we didn't have the idea of inclusion and diversity the same way that we do now. And I felt like it was a compelling argument back then, and it's still a compelling argument now, that if you do the work to make a screen reader be able to read the information in your application, or to allow voice control of your application. All of that work also helps people that need to automate and quality assure your product. It's very connected. And so this was like one of the big marketing pushes back then. I feel like it's gone away from how people explain it, but it literally still exists today. Like in everything you do for making things accessible would help you from test automation or like making sure that you have a quality product just purely from testing the product. So I started with that, and I feel like it still is totally true today. Another funny story, I lived in Japan the last 4 years, and one thing that was just a funny historical moment for me is that I also was working with the Japanese project managers on Windows Vista on enabling access to how to type and speak Japanese on Windows Vista. And I put this in the summary of my talk, but I really felt so underqualified to be specifying that feature. And I mean, I put a simple example that now I understand, living in Japan 4 years, but there's like 3 ways to type cat in Japanese, and there's the kanji, there's the hiragana, and there's the katakana, and this is what I needed to know and understand to actually design the feature to work well for people. But I basically was just assigned that at Microsoft, like, okay, make it work. I really didn't know anything about that there even are 3 ways to write letters in Japanese, and I was told make that accessible. So what I worked on, and at the time, again, I felt like I was doing a good job, but in reality, it's just so unrealistic. You need to be much more educated, right, to do these implementations. And I guess I would just say that when I look back at it, maybe in the youth, I was like, well, I can do it, or I'm gonna do it, but asking more questions and really trying to learn the problem. But anyway, another just story. A last thing, again, this is just a picture for me in accessibility, but Windows, when I worked there, they made a big decision to not have a single screen reader for the operating system. So a screen reader is what a blind person would use to interact with the operating system. At the time, they were really worried about consent decree, and they'd already gotten in trouble for Internet Explorer being this dominant browser. So they were worried that if they made a screen reader that was really good, it would put these other screen readers out of business. And I just really want to be like, that's wrong, because you need to first have a really good screen reader for your platform, and then you should enable people to innovate beyond what you provide. But they kind of at that time, they purposely made narrator bad. So if I bought Windows, I can't really use narrator to access it. And I just think that's so horrible, and that's not something we should repeat ever on any system. I would advocate that if you build a platform, you have to have a screen reader, one screen reader that works. And then you should also enable people to advance, but you shouldn't say we're going to purposefully not make a good product. And that's literally what happened. So, that's why we had this little problem of JAWS, NVDA, and narrator has been consulting boon for many people, because now you've got to work with 3 companies to try to make your product work for a blind person. And I feel like it would be better to say make it work with the one that's on the platform, and then these other ones should work. So we have that on iOS, and I feel like we've kind of moved there, but each one should have it. That's my point there. Next one, time at Mozilla. So after Microsoft, I was like, wow, that's so corporate. I should work for open source and change my, work with the open source. Everything should be free. So I worked on the ARIA 1.1, the Rich Internet applications. And, you know, for me personally, like, I feel like this is very important to work on these technical standards, but I'm not the kind of person that should be working on that. And so one of my takeaways from it is we need this, but we have to be really careful of like over designing or making things too complicated. So one of the prototypical examples for this spec was at this time, desktop controls came to the web. So back then, there wasn't a slider control on the web. So you didn't have a way to have a slider, but we had those on desktop computers. So one of Aria's solutions was like, well, we can help you make a slider that works on the web. And they did, but think about all the different kinds of controls. It basically became you had to document down to the most minute thing, every type of control that used to exist on the desktop, put it on the web. And personally, like what I felt like happened was basically none of the implementations worked. They would only work in one browser, or they would not work. And so it became like this idea that it's cool that we had this idea, but if it doesn't work, if it doesn't actually work for the people with disabilities, why are we doing it? And so it took, I feel like 10 years, which is scary in technology, for this to even like get implemented where it would work consistently. And that's really hard when you're trying to tell someone you should do this if you can't show that it actually works for someone, because it's more theoretical. And so I would say that I feel like that still exists today with people working on standards. It's like you really should make sure you have the demo of it working to explain to someone why they should do it. And I was in a kind of a bad place of like, I built this site called Cue Music. I made toolbars, and it was basically like a way to queue up like Flash, Player 8, you can tell this is really old. But it was like to queue up songs on YouTube, and it was like lists, and then a toolbar and a slider. And I built all these things to show that you can build this on the web, and here's how you do it. And Mozilla paid me to do that. But what was the end result was I could get it to work sort of like with Mozilla only, and only if you did this and that. And like there wasn't really a way to make this great statement of like, wow, we have a technical standard, and if you do this, everything works. So it was a really kind of hard project for me to explain why other people should do it. You know, I was getting paid to sort of show, here's how you do it, but it didn't actually work in most browsers. And so I feel like that's also changed with ARIA, but I would again point that out with new standards. It's like if you can't show that it works, it's really hard to convince someone else to do it, because it's very theoretical. So web standards should be simple to understand, easy to implement. And then I'm going to kind of finish here with this. My time as a CTO, one thing, this doesn't really matter, I'm going to skip this. One thing with the company that I worked with, and I feel like it informed why my company, Equal Entry, works really differently today, is that I did work on really big projects at High Software, and it was a company that had an automated scanning tool. It could scan, you know, 1 million web pages and tell you all the different problems that you have. And so one of our clients was Procter & Gamble. They have like 80 brands they own. They've got like so many different websites. We could scan all their websites. We also had the VA, and the VA had all these different regions, you know. So like when you're in tech, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm building this solution. I'm scanning region 1, Sacramento, and Orlando's region 3, and I came to New York, Brooklyn. I'm making the world accessible, but honestly, what I learned from the whole thing was just like, we were producing these reports, and I mean, sorry, this is horrible cropping, but they would just be these charts like, okay, this is green, this is red, this is yellow. And unfortunately at the time, the clients would be okay with like, oh, are we more green than red? Like, did the green go up? Like, and I'm like, none of that means anything. Like, it doesn't mean that a person with a disability can use the site. But in that time period, that's how they were translating it. They'd be like, well, more green means we're good. And that's just like really informed how I've worked after that. Like, that's not how it works. And that's totally, it would just be so hard to understand that, oh, I had 50, I think I have a screenshot here. I have 666, that's kind of a scary number, non-decorative image elements that have an empty alt attribute. And you're like, okay, like 666, is it better that now you have 500 or 522? Like, it doesn't really connotate to, can someone use the site? So I just lived that for multiple years at this company where I would have to try to explain this data. And I have kind of the critique of today that I feel like a lot of companies still do this. They're just like, we're going to help you solve this and we're going to fix everything. Or, overlay companies are kind of a current whipping child of like, you shouldn't do that. But it's like, it doesn't really make sense to look at it this way. You have to look at like, can you log in? Can you purchase something? What's the purpose of using whatever you're doing? Can you do that? And so that's really why I've changed my company so much, because I spent years trying to explain these things to people and watching them be excited when the numbers went up, but knowing that it didn't really mean anything. So accessibility audits should be focused on real problems with specific end results, not technical compliance. That's that. And then this was another thing, just I think it's funny to go back. Again, I think I critique technology a lot, but 2007, we built this whole thing to fix all these problems. It's basically like an overlay company. So yeah, I worked for an overlay company. Confession. And ours was very well documented. We had explanations of why you need to use all of these features, but it really doesn't just change the fact that we were basically doing all of this work because Microsoft SharePoint wasn't accessible. So if Microsoft SharePoint was accessible, you wouldn't need to purchase this thing. Like, it should have been accessible, but we as a company were like, well, it's not, so you need to buy this thing. And it's just, again, it's just such a bad way to solve the problem, because it basically meant every company that bought Microsoft SharePoint, if they wanted to be accessible, they also have to talk to another company and buy their services. So, what it should have been is SharePoint was totally accessible and we just helped them fix the things they customized. But I'll just kind of, we're kind of at the time here. I'll end here with just saying, like, this is funny for me to look back at my career, because maybe overlay companies are like, we're doing something very new. And I'm like, no, this was like exactly the same thing in 2007. And it had all the same problems then. Like, it didn't ever work and it didn't really fix the problem. So there's not really like, now, years later, you can just automatically add code and it's accessible. So it didn't work then, it doesn't work now. And I'll put it over here to Cameron, so we'll do some Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Thomas. Let's hear a round of applause for Thomas, please. This is a really rare treat for me too, because I get to hear the history and like the repeated history and like no holds barred. So I appreciate you, Thomas. So let's open up to questions. Do we have any questions in the room that would like to? Sean, here you go.
First of all, Thomas, just thank you so much. I know we have a lot of private conversations about, it's just, first of all, you're too humble. I didn't even know you had done like basically 3/4 of that stuff. So That's really cool. I think my question for you is, you talked about egos. How do you think we can mitigate that? Or is that always going to be there? And do you think that's what motivated you to start your own company? Because you knew what your intentions are and that you would have more control?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I definitely don't know how you mitigate ego because I guess it's just how we navigate our lives. But I feel like I could just very much in the beginning, I think I mentioned I worked with IBM, Sun, and Microsoft. And I already knew at that time we're basically all saying the same thing. But there was such a antagonism of like, this is this company, this is this company. I mean, I guess one way for me is like just to be like, it doesn't matter, like call it the same thing. But I don't know how to like actually make that happen because people do really dig in to it. For me, doing my own company, I guess, yeah, there's an ego of watching people do things. Like, for example, I really didn't like the way that High Software operated it. And I was like, I don't want it to be, for me, it felt like a lie to say, oh, you made something better. And that's still, I guess, what matters to me now. But, you know, maybe I have an ego in that too, so I can get checked. But yeah, I think that's my biggest point of like, I think the work I do now, I'm just always trying to push people. Like I say, I'm not good at working on standards. I kind of got burned. I do think they're really important, and I use them in like the legal work that I do. So I'm like, I want to lift up the people that do the work, but I also want to be like, just make a decision and set it in stone. Because for someone like me that wants to make change, I just need it written down in stone. I don't really care if you do it this way or this way. I just want to be able to tell someone, you have to do this. And that's kind of like VR, virtual reality. I've had that problem for like the last 4 years. I'm like, just put it down and I can get people to do it. But right now they're like, it's so new, we can't set it. And I'm like, well, if you don't set it, I can't actually make the change. And so that's my part where I'm like, I want someone that has the drive to set all that down, to set it, and then I'll support them. Yeah.
Great. Ben? Question?
Just because you brought up VR, I'm curious if you've had an opportunity yet to. Today, I was watching WWDC session on Apple's take on accessibility for spatial computing, and I'm curious if you've had a chance to kind of dig into what they've got yet. And kind of what your take on it is. Like, obviously, Apple always kind of does their own thing when it comes to how they approach accessibility. But one of the things that they said is this platform has the most accessibility features we've ever launched with the first release of a new platform. So, as compared to other folks in the XR space, like, do you feel like there's movement in the direction of, at least at a platform level, they've got some APIs where others don't, to allow people to build better experiences? And I know that's kind of pivoting towards like XR topic more so than this, but I'm just kind of curious on if you've had a chance to look at that yet.
Well, I'll shout out Meryl, that Meryl's already written an article on this topic, and I haven't looked at it in detail, but my assumption, which I feel like is validated, I think Apple has been doing a great job in the V1 product, just showing they're doing something, and they might get it wrong, but I'm like, they're taking action, and they are showing, here's how we're solving this problem. And maybe it's not the right one, but it's different than like Meta, who didn't do anything, right? In the multiple versions, HTC didn't do anything with their product. So I have a lot more respect. I feel like Apple Watch used to be the one I would like champion. Like, well, they made a watch that they considered this in the V1. So I support them, at least from that idea. And I would say probably a lot of the ideas they come up with should be patterned and implemented across the board. But yeah, I haven't really seen too many details on it. But yeah, again, going back in history, like another famous story for me is like the Microsoft phone, which doesn't exist anymore, did not have any accessibility. Like none of the releases considered accessibility, and you're like, well, now you don't exist, and like this is actually, you know, it's a trope or it's a cliche, but I'm like, yeah, if you make things work for people with disabilities, they work better for everyone, and that's why people like the products. And so if you look at the products that don't do it, like I do hope like Apple really succeeds and shows the other companies, yeah, you have to do this, you can't ignore it. And it's happened in the past. History repeats itself.
Amazing. We have a question from the live stream, and this is about what the best way to get a start in accessibility in IT. So a career question is: would you recommend doing accessibility auditing, user testing with people with disabilities? What's your thought on starting a career in accessibility?
Right. Well, we didn't get there into my slides, but I guess when I was going to transition from this CTO nightmare to the other company I worked at that was consulting had a lot of employees with disabilities, and I really felt like I learned so much from working with colleagues with disabilities. So I guess number one, it's like if you're going to work in this field, you need to have connections and or like know people that this impacts, because it's again going from the theoretical to the real. One thing I really liked working at, they were called SSB BART Group then, they're called Level Access now, but a lot of the things that they would recommend to the clients came from the people that worked there, and they were like, this is really hard to use, or you know, this, it wasn't WCAG and it wasn't the accessibility guidelines, it was actually just the reality of being the person using it. So I will always emphasize that. And then I guess the second point for like employment in this industry now is I do think things like IAAP, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, while some people may see that as an unnecessary sort of cost to doing this work, I really always saw that as a benefit. And I would recommend people that want to work in the industry, if you go for the certification, like one thing that's good about doing the certification, there is a common set of standards that you're getting harmonized with, and then you can actually use that when you're applying for jobs or trying to get work. You can say, well, you know, I did use this standard. So I wouldn't say like only do that, but that's something that I think didn't exist when I started, that now I feel like you do have a path to study and learn this field. And I do think people get rewarded for like having the certification.
I could just imagine that person online being, if they're, what would you recommend to people who say, oh, I don't know where to find people with disabilities to talk to? One of the places that I recommend is Real Abilities Film Festival, because there's a lot of firsthand narratives and it's well attended by the community. But I would imagine that as a follow-up question if somebody isn't already plugged in. So put that out there.
Well, and it's a plug for our meetup. You know, I think that's one of the things that we wanted from our group from the start. You know, and we've learned so much from doing this meetup over the years, but I feel like it's really nice to have so many people here in person. I feel like that was always the whole thing about doing this meetup group, and we would, like Cameron, Sean, and I would learn something after every meetup, and we would meet people that, you know, we just kept meeting different people with different types of disabilities. You know, we learned about like having a plug for an electric wheelchair from doing the event. We learned about having captions.
Oh no.
Oh my gosh. We learned
Right.
about having
We need a mouse jiggler. That's what those
dramatic pause.
are. Wait for it.
Captions. We kind of started the meetup being like not planning for that, and immediately we got feedback from the community like expecting that, and it was really good for us. So I would tell people wherever they are, like go to your community. I mean, in New York, you have our group and you have your group, and there's lots of groups. So depending on where you are in the world, like look for people that are doing, engagement and like introducing people.
So you mentioned in the beginning that you were targeting big companies and that ideally platform support is present. So it sounds like you are wanting or you envision approaching the problem from the top down. I'm just wondering what you think is how you achieve the tipping point of effectiveness and awareness.
Well, I have a very like dark perspective on that as an American because I think lawsuits, seriously, because that's really been I didn't get into that in my presentation, but that's where I got to. I mean, I'm not saying that should be everyone's thing, but I think that's actually something I'm proud of about the US, that you can actually say, hey, you're not complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act. You need to change that. And living in Japan, for example, they don't have that. So they don't have a way to bring the change to the company. I think that what I'm aware of here in the US is like people don't sue the big companies because you never win because they have expensive lawyers. So people generally don't sue Microsoft, Google, Adobe. They sue the government agencies, and then they often can win those lawsuits because you need to be accessible. But in my opinion, it's like they're not the ones that can fix the problem. They can fix it in a micro level, but they can't actually fix it in, across the places. So for most of the legal work I've done, I've always been, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just more like, but the onus should be on the people that make the product. And there's just been so many examples of that in my career where if, for example, Adobe, Microsoft, Google changed like a couple things, WordPress, millions of people would have it working. Whereas if you say, no, the onus is on the government agency that bought WordPress or is using WordPress, they can only fix it for that one thing. So I guess in my, it's not like targeting the big ones, it's just more like I really believe the companies that are the biggest that make these platforms, they have the responsibility to solve the problems. And there's still things that people downstream from that have to solve, but they won't have to solve as many things if those companies do it.
Hi, my name is Keita. I'm Japanese to be, and my question is related to what you just said. From your experience or thought, how would you recommend Japanese people or Japanese, companies, people to empower people with disabilities and also try to make these accessibility things more prevalent and how to say things we things we do without any hassle, because as you said, in Japan currently we don't have any legal legislation. So that the motivation, what I've heard from my friends, they want to do that, but they just do not have the money or resource or time. They have to prioritize other things. So how would you recommend, or any thought about that?
Nice to meet you. I think that in Japan, one thing I thought was interesting is there is a law about percentages of employment for people with disabilities. And what I learned, which I don't know that this is like a widely held truth, but I did learn that certain companies that didn't hire enough people with disabilities got put on like a government shame list. And I'm like, I guess in Japan, one thing that I learned, if you got put on that list, there's a big repercussion. So in my American way of thinking, I'm like, okay, well, there's a risk if you don't employ people with disabilities because there is a law saying you need to, I think it's 2% or 3%. But if you don't do that, which I feel like most companies don't, make them have a repercussion would be how I would still think of it, because it's really hard to get people, in my experience, to do the right thing. And I feel like I would take advantage of any law that exists to try to also, I mean, do the right thing, but also, you know, if you don't, here's your repercussion. So that's the only one I'm aware of right now in Japan, but that's one. Yeah.
For countries like that where there's not sufficient kind of enforcement infrastructure in place, have you found success in, you know, not just do the right thing, but making a strong business case for here is how you can expand your addressable market. Here's the revenue opportunity for you if you do this. Like appeal to the top line and bottom line thinking, as opposed to appeal to what may not be a strong enforcement environment. Like, have you found success in taking that approach?
Personally, no, but you know, I hate to say that, but I do feel like maybe my observations of people in Canada, UK, and Australia, I feel like it does seem to work in those countries, and they do have that works. I really don't feel like that's ever worked for me in the US. So, I mean, I wish it did, but it's not been my experience here. But I feel like I have met people that I trust them, like, oh, no, it can work. I just feel like for me, it's never worked here.
Are there more questions from the room? This is, yeah.
Hey, Thomas, sorry for walking in late. I'm definitely new to, you know, just kind of thinking about accessibility and working in accessibility. What would you say is like a good starting point if you're in an org right now that doesn't necessarily like have a high value for building accessible applications and optimizing for and thinking about the user that might have different needs? What would be your advice to like someone who's just at the engineer level, who is interested in, you know, either shifting the culture in the org or just being able to do, you know, something in my own work to be able to make an impact like on the org, to shift that like culture, you know, towards that direction?
One idea is actually having someone that uses your product or service with a disability come in and give a demo. I feel like that has the strongest motivation for people that have no awareness, because especially if you don't have people with disabilities working in your organization, just having someone come in, demo it, especially for developers. I've really found that, you know, developers don't want their thing not to work for people, and me telling someone you don't comply with WCAG 2 1.2.1 success, it's not the same as someone using the screen reader and being like, I'm trying to do this and I can't do it. That's a very powerful way to change people's minds. So I would say, you know, asking someone, especially if you have someone, a user group for your product or service, if they've ever complained or like had feedback to your org, be like, yeah, come demo and show what your experience is. I think that does change people's minds. So that'd be my first idea.
Thomas, how are you doing? You want a couple more questions?
I think let's do one more.
Okay, one more from the chat then. How did you start a company focused on accessibility, and what are some of the challenges running equal entry?
Oh, wow. Yeah. You're my therapist. Well, I guess for starting the company, it definitely came from working for other consulting companies that were doing the exact same thing and just being like, wow, if these people can do it, and I don't necessarily agree with them, I can do it too. And I definitely, the same time we started the Meetup here in New York City, it's basically the exact same time I started my company. So I feel like the idea of, you know, having a point of view and building this community. It was like completely tied together. And I do also like attribute it to New York City. Like I like the drive. NYC. I was living in San Francisco before then, and I feel like I was a little more West Coast then and not feeling that. And I came here and I was like, no, I want to do it. And it was just so cool. Like, I mean, meeting Cameron and Sean, like Jennison Asuncion from LinkedIn, he introduced us, and it happened really fast. And when we started the meetup here, we had so many people interested just right from the start. So it kind of showed there was a lot of interest. So that's kind of, I mean, in why I started it is probably mostly tied to my work at High Software and less at Level Access, where I'm like, I didn't agree with the way that I presented working on accessibility and during that phase, and I wanted to do it differently. And then I guess the challenges are, I guess I see my company as more of like a boutique, and there are, accessibility has changed a lot in time. There's companies that get millions of dollars in funding now, like Accessibly, Level Access, DQ. They all have like multi-million-dollar funding. And so they're going to have a totally different value proposition than like something that's bootstrapped like me. So I guess that I would say that's kind of a challenge, but I do better meeting people directly, like at this meetup. And I feel like I just try to share that it's my passion, and I want to do that. And I work with people that share that. So
Amazing. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. I want to close on a couple of notes. I want to say thank you to our sponsors again, Asana, where we are today for our space, Events, Equal Entry, and Fable, who is, I might add, a disability run and owned business, and they offer a lot of the kind of services that Thomas was describing, bring in someone with a disability to test your software and more. And also Google for sponsoring us. And again, to Thomas's point about community, join the Meetup group. It's meetup.com/A11yNYC. And also subscribe on YouTube, because we stream every single one of these. It's youtube.com/A11yNYC. Thank you all for joining tonight. We have a couple more minutes in the space, and I'll let you know when we need to leave. Thank you.
thank you.